we've got quite a tasty 4K gaming monitor on review. It's the HP Omen 27u. It sports a 4K 144Hz IPS panel. It also has HDR400 certification and AMD FreeSync technology, and better still, the fabled HDMI 2.1 port is in utilization. All of this coming in at a somewhat affordable price of £600 in the UK and $700 in the US. Now in this review you can see if it's actually worth its price tag and how it compares to some of its competitors. Before jumping into this video, I would like to thank Philips for actually sponsoring it. More on them further down in this video. Now to kick off this video, I do want to quickly touch upon inputs, and here it's got DisplayPort 1.4, HDMI 2.1 and HDMI 2.0. Now here over DP 1.4, I was able to output 4K at 144Hz at up to 10-bit, which is pretty impressive, but better still, over HDMI 2.1, I was able to output the same resolution and refresh rate, but up to 12-bit. Now of course for console gamers, you'll be limited to 4K 120, and that's due to the limitations of course, your source device. Now with that out of the way, let's talk about its gaming performance, and let's jump straight in and talk about input lag. Now this is actually quite intriguing. See here, I had it objectively tested at 4.4 milliseconds, which is actually the slowest that I've tested to date. Equally, in comparison to other 4K gaming monitors, it doesn't fare all that well. Now while 4.4 milliseconds is disappointing, it's nowhere near as shocking as the initial 8.4 milliseconds that I had tested using my regular testing methodology. See, all the other monitors that you've seen over here, we're using an Acer monitor as my reference point, and this is then for benchmarked over a CRT, so therefore giving me an accurate input lag figure. Now here, this monitor was then tested in comparison to an AOC gaming monitor, which is the first time that I've actually used it in order to give me a reference point. Now in this respect, the only reason I want to point this out is because I felt that 8.4 milliseconds objectively, and by the way I ran the test 6 times over, didn't seem to reflect my own subjective opinion about this monitor. See, here I'm someone who shoved over 2,500 hours on competitive Counter-Strike, and from my own opinion, I felt that the input lag of 8.4 milliseconds wasn't reflecting my actual input of this monitor. See, 4.4 milliseconds seemed to be a bit more in line with what I would expect. It's not exactly a monitor I would use for hardcore competitive gaming, and yes, it is slower in comparison to some of the faster gaming monitors out there, namely let's say non-4K monitors, but it's nowhere near as bad as 8.4 milliseconds, which I would be able to easily note. And I know we're talking about milliseconds, but for someone who's reviewed over 200 different panels, and again, played over 2,500 hours of competitive Counter-Strike, I can safely say that I can notice the difference between a faster or slower input lag. Now with the mind-boggling input lag testing out of the way, let's talk about its response time. Now here it's very much linked with the overdrive mode that you select. On the Omen 27u you go from level 1 all the way to level 5. Level 5 being the fastest mode, although this will also incur a significant amount of inverse ghosting versus let's say the lower level modes. Now in my case, I actually liked using this monitor on level 3 mode while playing a game like Destiny 2, while dialing it to the level 4 mode because the amount of inverse ghosting was present, but not too severe for me to throw off my shots. Now let me put this into perspective and put some numbers across your screen. Now here you can see a screenshot of the OSRTT tool, and at the bottom left hand side of your screen you'll see average initial time. This is tested on the level 1 mode at 144Hz, and you can see it coming in at 6.11 milliseconds. Now if we switch over to level 2, you can see this drops down to 5.22 milliseconds. Then moving over to level 3 mode, you can see here it drops down to 4.36 milliseconds, which is actually pretty impressive for a gaming panel. Now I'd like to shift your eyes towards the RGB overshoot, which can be found towards the middle of your screen. You can see here in comparison to the other levels, it's actually starting to turn a bit off green or indeed orange. So here now we shift over to level 4, and yes, suddenly you've got a lot more red on your screen, which effectively is trying to translate as RGB overshoot coming in. Now you can see here on the flip side that the average initial times does drop down to 3.51 milliseconds, and on the level 5 mode where we've got an even more amount of overshoot, you can see here it drops down to a stupidly low 2.96 milliseconds. Reiterating the point that if you do want a good visual experience, go on to level 3, and if your eyes can take it or if the game is less graphically intense, you might want to go to level 4 mode. Now, to further solidify the test and to explain what I'm meaning over here, you can see the different level overdrive modes, whereby at level 4 mode you can see a little bit of trailing occurring behind the UFO, while at the level 5 mode it becomes pretty unbearable, and indeed that does reflect the real world experience. Now on the right hand side you will be able to see MPRT mode, and indeed over here there's a little bracket which is labeled 3, and this is because it's in relation to the level overdrive modes. In my case I had it tested with the level 3 overdrive mode with MPRT dialed up to its maximum level. This is actually quite a rarity because normally you do not see overdrive modes able to be selected when MPRT mode is enabled. So here you can see that the UFO is a lot clearer. And indeed in real world applications you'll be able to note that your game or indeed character models will be a lot clearer because the motion blur has been reduced. Now note, with my camera there is a lot of flickering that occurs, but in real life, in other words using your eyes, you won't notice any of the flickering, so do not worry about this problem. Now it is worth pointing out that MPRT mode cannot be used simultaneously with adaptive sync technologies, and therefore you can't run it with NVIDIA G-Sync nor AMD FreeSync. Now this does actually perfectly bring me on to the VRR technologies. In my case I had no sort of flickering or black screen issues on the NVIDIA Pendulum demo, and equally when I was playing Destiny 2 at 4K at 144Hz with HDR, I was also able to run NVIDIA G-Sync, therefore giving me a good tear-free gaming experience. Although it's worth noting that this does not have a native G-Sync module and as such cannot benefit from the full VRR range. Instead it sits from 48Hz up to 144Hz. Now this should only be a cause for concern if you are going to be dropping below those 48Hz, and as a result you might want to be looking at a monitor that does have a native G-Sync module in order for you to get an even smoother experience. Now I did mention HDR in testing, and indeed the monitor does have display HDR 400 certification. From my own test it did hit over 400 nits. Now here the monitor's HDR performance is actually not too bad in comparison to other HDR 400 monitors, and the reason behind that is because the overall color accuracy seems to be retained. In other words, it's very nice to look at and the image does seem to pop a little bit more in HDR in comparison to SDR. However, make no mistake, it's no competition to monitors that have HDR 600 certification or full array local dimming. Of course, you're going to have to splash out more for said monitors, specifically at the 4K 144Hz resolution and refresh rate, but it's just something I thought to point out in order to set your expectations in check. Speaking of which, you would expect this monitor to output 4K at 120Hz, and indeed it does for modern day consoles thanks to the inclusion of a full bandwidth HDMI 2.1 port. Now I had it also objectively tested using the OSRTT tool, and you can see on your screen that on level 1 mode it's very similar to the 144Hz results, whereby the average initial time sits at 5.91 milliseconds. Shifting to level 2 mode it goes to 5.17 milliseconds. Going on to level 3, which is the recommended mode at least in my opinion, it goes to 4.37 milliseconds. Going over to level 4, whereby you'll incur some inverse ghosting, it goes down to 3.65 milliseconds, and then at level 5 mode it goes down all the way to 2.96 milliseconds. Now note, these were tested at 120Hz, and here you can see the visual experience and the UFO ghosting test. Indeed, yet again I would suggest level 3 mode, but if your eyes can take it then you might want to dial into level 4 mode. Now on the side, I would like to point out that with my RTX 3080 that has an HDMI 2.1 port, I was able to output 4K at 144Hz while also simultaneously running HDR and NVIDIA G-Sync, all of which are certainly appreciated, and therefore further re-emphasizes the point that this is a full bandwidth HDMI 2.1 port and can be definitely utilized for console gamers. Now past this gaming performance, what about when it comes to image quality? Well, here the monitor has got a 27-inch flat IPS panel with some slight matte coating on it. Now in this respect, the monitor does also have a dedicated sRGB mode, although it's not labelled that in the OST, but rather mentioned as standard. Now in said mode, via my calibrators, I noted a gamut coverage of 96.4% and 99.5% in gamut volume in comparison to the sRGB standard, which is pretty impressive, and you can see below how it compares. Equally, its color accuracy sat at an average delta of 1.15 and a maximum of 2.83. AG3, thus being perfectly usable for serious image editing work or video grading. As for its tested contrast ratio, it sat at 1053:1, while its measured white point in comparison to the 6504 Kelvin target sat pretty close at 6799K at 100%. Equally, its gamma curve was pretty similar to the 2.2 standards. Now, while its sRGB mode will be appealing to editors out there, for gamers you might want to run on its native mode preset because it has a wider color gamut. Now here you'll be able to see on your screen the DCI-P3 results. Indeed, over here you can see that the average delta sits at 3.71 and maximum of 7.22. And you can see here how the gamut coverage and volumes are affected, specifically positively in the Adobe RGB and DCI-P3 spaces. Now the white point does shift at 6601 Kelvin at 100%, therefore being even tighter, but you can see here that the monitor does not hit the 2.6 gamma standard where the DCI-P3 mode really shines. Effectively, what I'm trying to convey over here is that for image editors or video editors in the DCI-P3 space or Adobe RGB space might want to look elsewhere, but for gamers out there, the overall image saturation and the color pop that you get in said mode, in other words native in comparison to the standard mode preset, will certainly be appreciated. Now you might have noticed the brightness figures on your screen, so let's talk about them. Here in HDR I noticed up to 452 nits, therefore far surpassing the 400 nit standard required for display HDR 400 certification. SDR brightness is still also very high at 420 nits, while it also does get all the way down to 65 nits. Now on the subject of peak luminous, this does bring me onto brightness uniformity, and on my tested panel, which I appreciate is somewhat panel lottery, it actually did fare pretty well, only doing a little bit worse towards the bottom left hand side of your screen. However, in terms of backlight bleed, it was actually not that impressive. You can notice over here that bleed comes from every single four corner, and while this didn't exactly throw me off, if it's something of a concern to you, in other words if you're consuming a lot of dark scenes or for example playing a lot of dark games, then you might want to look at some VA alternatives or even TN alternatives in order to alleviate any sort of backlight bleeds. Now moving past these tests, let's talk about build quality, and here the monitor has got a four-side borderless design, which is certainly aesthetically pleasing, although it's worth noting that due to this, the stand only limits you to height and tilt adjustments only, therefore you cannot pivot or swivel it like you'd find on some alternatives out there. However, you can replace this with a VESA compatible stand in order to give you the full sort of controls that you might desire. Speaking of which, via a conveniently placed joystick button placed behind the monitor, you can access the hardware-based OSD, and indeed over here allows you to customize the monitor to your heart's content, giving you a plethora of different options, from disabling the power LED that's located at the front of the monitor to adjusting the overdrive modes as I did mention before. Better still, HP also provide the Omen gaming hub, which gives you the ability to adjust further settings. You'll find the same sort of ones that come from the hardware-based OSD, but gives you even more customization when it comes to the RGB lights. And yes, this monitor does have some backward and bottom firing lights. In this respect, the one that is positioned towards the front refracts off the stand, which therefore means that you can actually see the light projected on your desk, which is a cool little inclusion by HP, but of course it's not something that I actually use, so I actually fully disable all the RGB lights. Now elsewhere, the monitor does also have two built-in speakers and therefore provides some sort of audio, although I will definitely suggest getting a set of bookshelf speakers or for example a headphone DAC or a headset in order for you to get better audio reproduction. And yes, if you do want to route audio directly from the monitor, there is also a 3.5mm output jack. Now as for other features, the monitor has got a USB Type-C input, which can be useful if you want to plug in your peripherals directly into the two USB Type-A ports that can be found on the monitor, although it's worth noting that this does not have a built-in KVM switch, which perfectly leads us onto today's video sponsor, Philips. Indeed, the manufacturer of premium monitors provides numerous productivity solutions. Some models have USB Type-C connectivity, allowing you to simultaneously charge your laptop and display an image. Others have that sought-after built-in KVM switch, which enables you to plug in your peripherals straight into your monitor and seamlessly switch between sources. Elsewhere, daisy chain technology allows you to use a singular source cable for two monitors, effectively freeing up a display output on your graphics card. To find out more about Philips solutions, follow the link in the description below. So with all that in mind, it brings me on to my verdict of the HP Omen 27u. And on the whole, it's actually a pretty good monitor. See here, it's got a 4K 144Hz IPS panel, which is very color accurate, has got good response times, has also got that fabled HDMI 2.1 port, has got a bunch of different features built in, and furthermore, is actually pretty affordable, at least as far as 4K gaming monitors go with HDMI 2.1. As such, it gets my Value Award. Now, I couldn't quite give it my performance or my best buy award purely because of the input lag figures that I attained. Again, reiterating the point that I had two different input lag figures, and therefore it's just something that you should be mindful about. Now, I'd be curious to know what you make of the Omen 27u down in the comment section below, and I would like to thank Philips yet again for sponsoring this video. Now, if you've liked this independent detail review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which are certainly appreciated. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye.